Between his legs, the rain had just stopped, but the city streets still glistened under the soft morning light. Lena tightened her grip on the red delivery bag slung across her shoulder. Another order, another random building, another stranger's door. She was used to it. Get in, drop off the food, leave before anyone asked questions. But as soon as she stepped through the tall glass doors of the office complex, her stomach dropped. He was here. Mateo, her ex, the man she had been avoiding for months. And now, he was standing by the coffee machine in the lobby, like a shadow from her past suddenly brought to life. Lena, his voice carried across the room, smooth but sharp. Hey, wait, let's talk. No, not today. Not ever. She spun around, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, and bolted down the hallway. Her heart pounded in her ears. She could almost hear his footsteps picking up speed behind her. If he caught up, it would be the same old trap, the same lines he'd used 100 times. We were perfect together. Remember our playlist? I know you miss me. Every word a hook, trying to pull her back into the net she had fought so hard to escape. She turned a corner and spotted a long table. A man stood in front of it, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, eyes fixed on a tablet. He looked like someone important, someone who didn't waste time with strangers. Lena didn't care. She ran straight to him, dropped to the floor, and crouched between his legs, pressing the delivery bag tightly against her chest. Please pretend you didn't see me, she whispered urgently, her forehead almost brushing the fabric of his suit trousers. The man froze, looking down with wide eyes. What? Just 30 seconds, she pleaded, looking up between his knees. That guy saw me. He's always following me. He's an ex. Okay, I know too. His is weird, but please help me. He didn't move at first. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, then back down at her. His face was unreadable, caught somewhere between confusion and curiosity. Hurried footsteps echoed closer, and then Mateo's voice filled the air. Excuse me, sir. Have you seen a girl run by? Red backpack? The suited man took a slow, deep breath. She ran that way, he said calmly, pointing toward the opposite corridor. She looked like she was in a hurry. Mateo nodded quickly. Thanks, man, he said, rushing off in the wrong direction. The hallway fell silent again. Lena stayed still, her breath shaky. She was too scared to move until she heard the man above her clear his throat. You can come out now, he said in a deep, steady voice. She slowly rose to her feet, meeting his gaze for the first time. He was impossibly handsome. Strong jaw, sharp eyes, but there was something else, a quiet power in the way he stood. Thank you, she said softly. I didn't know what else to do. His eyes narrowed, studying her like she was some puzzle he couldn't solve. Who are you? He asked. Lena, she replied. And I owe you. A small smile tugged at his lips. Ethan, he said, and you're lucky you picked the right stranger. She didn't know what he meant by that, but something in his voice told her this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The stranger with the steel eyes, Lena felt her pulse slowly settle, though her legs still carried a faint tremble. The adrenaline from running, hiding, and almost being cornered by Mateo hadn't fully drained from her system. Ethan's presence, calm, tall, and steady, was like standing under a solid roof during a storm. She didn't know why, but she had the oddest sense that if she just stayed near him for another few minutes, nothing bad could touch her. He didn't speak right away, and in the silence, she became aware of how strange the situation must look. A delivery girl crouching between the legs of a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a business magazine. It wasn't exactly a normal introduction. She opened her mouth to explain, but before the words could form, Ethan's gaze sharpened, shifting from her to something behind her shoulder. In the reflection of a glass panel across the hallway, Lena caught the faint blur of movement. Mateo had returned, walking slower this time, scanning every corner as if he knew she was still nearby. Ethan stepped forward instinctively, placing his body between Lena and the open space, his broad frame acting as a wall. He didn't say anything, but the subtle tilt of his chin told her to stay still. It was strange, she barely knew him, yet his quiet authority made her follow without hesitation. As Mateo passed the far end of the corridor, Ethan began speaking in an even low tone, not looking at her, but clearly choosing his words for her ears. If you're going to hide from someone in this building, you pick the right person. No one gets in here without my knowledge. Lena frowned in confusion, her instincts telling her this man wasn't just an employee or an ordinary passerby. The way people in the lobby had glanced at him earlier, the way he stood like the space belonged to him, it all hinted at something more. When the sound of Mateo's footsteps faded, Ethan finally stepped back, his eyes meeting hers fully for the first time. There was a steadiness there, but also a flicker of curiosity, like he was measuring her story before deciding if she was worth his time. "You're shaking," he observed, his voice carrying no judgment, only an unspoken question. She swallowed and tightened her grip on the delivery bag. "He doesn't leave me alone," she admitted quietly, the words heavier now that the immediate danger had passed. "I've blocked his number, moved apartments, even switched jobs twice, and somehow he still shows up. I don't even know how he found me today." Ethan listened without interrupting, and for someone who looked like he spent his life in a world of high-stakes deals and meetings, he had the rare ability to make silence feel safe rather than awkward. Lena shifted on her feet, suddenly aware she was lingering too long. She should leave before she dragged this stranger into her mess. "I should go. Thank you for what you did," she said, turning slightly toward the elevator. But Ethan's voice stopped her before she could take a step. "You still have that delivery to make?" She blinked, realizing she had almost forgotten the entire reason she was here. "Yes, to, Suite 45B. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips, one that didn't quite reach his eyes but made her stomach twist in a way she couldn't explain. "That's my office," he said. For a moment, Lena thought she had misheard. "Wait, you ordered this?" Ethan shook his head slightly. "No, but my assistant might have. Either way, if you came to my floor, you're in my building, which means you're under my protection while you're here." There was no arrogance in the way he said it, just a matter-of-fact confidence that made her believe him instantly. She followed him into the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting his composed posture and her still-flushed face. As the numbers climbed, she wondered who exactly Ethan was. She had never met anyone like him. Someone who could go from absolute stillness to decisive action without raising his voice. Someone who looked like he could dismantle a threat without breaking a sweat. And yet, there was something about the way he kept glancing at her in the reflection, as if he were just as curious about her as she was about him. Neither of them knew it yet, but this brief, strange encounter was about to pull them both into a chain of events that would make today unforgettable, for reasons neither could have imagined. The return of the shadow. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a floor unlike anything Lena had expected. The space was open, bathed in warm light from tall glass windows that offered a sweeping view of the city skyline. Modern furniture in deep, rich tones dotted the floor, and there was an air of quiet efficiency in the way employees moved, each one carrying tablets or files, speaking in hushed but focused tones. The moment Ethan stepped out, conversations seemed to pause just long enough for people to notice him. It wasn't the kind of attention that came from fear, but from respect, the way an orchestra falls silent when the conductor raises the baton. Lena followed a step behind, feeling as though she had stepped into another world entirely. Ethan led her to a sleek, glass-walled conference room and gestured for her to set the delivery bag on the table. His movements were smooth and deliberate, as if every step he took was part of a plan only he understood. While she unpacked the food containers, she could feel his gaze on her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her hyper-aware of herself. She wanted to speak, to thank him again for earlier, but her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp trill of his phone. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening ever so slightly before swearing. The voice on the other end was muffled, but Lena could tell from Ethan's short, clipped responses that it wasn't good news. He ended the call and looked at her with an expression that was unreadable yet somehow more intense than before. You need to stay here for a few minutes, he said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. Why? What's going on? Lena asked, her pulse quickening. Ethan didn't answer immediately, which only made the tension grow heavier. He stepped closer to the glass wall, looking out over the open office space, his eyes scanning like a hawk tracking movement. Then she saw it too, the elevator doors opening again. Mateo. But this time he wasn't pretending to be casual. His eyes were sharp, his movements purposeful, and when his gaze swept the floor, it locked onto Ethan's conference room in seconds. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what scared her more, the fact that Mateo had come back so quickly, or the fact that he looked angrier than she'd ever seen him before. He didn't wait to be invited in. He strode straight toward them, pushing the door open without knocking. You lied to me, he said flatly, his eyes darting to Lena and then back to Ethan. She didn't run that way. She was here the whole time. The air between the three of them thickened instantly. Lena instinctively took a step back, but Ethan didn't move. He didn't raise his voice or take an aggressive stance. Instead, he simply stood his ground, his stillness carrying more weight than most men's threats. I told you what I wanted you to hear, Ethan replied evenly. Now you're in my office without permission, and that's a mistake. Mateo let out a humorless laugh, glancing at Lena as if expecting her to defend him. You think you can hide behind him forever? You think he cares? He's just some rich guy you ran to. People like him don't get involved in messes like yours. Before Lena could respond, Ethan took a slow step forward, closing the distance between him and Mateo until there was less than a foot between them. You're in my building, on my floor, talking to someone under my protection. That means you're talking to me, Ethan said, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone that made even Lena's skin prickle. Mateo's smirk faltered, and for a brief moment he seemed unsure, as if he was realizing that the man he'd just confronted wasn't an ordinary obstacle. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. This isn't over, Mateo said finally, his words laced with false confidence. Ethan didn't answer. He simply turned his head slightly toward the open doorway, and as if on cue, 2 security guards appeared. They weren't the bulky, overly aggressive kind you saw in malls. They were the calm, watchful type, the kind that looked like they could end a situation without breaking a sweat. Escort him out, Ethan ordered quietly. Mateo's protests were short-lived. The guards moved with silent precision, guiding him toward the elevator. As he was taken away, Mateo threw one last look at Lena, a look that promised trouble. When the doors finally closed behind him, Lena exhaled, only then realizing she had been holding her breath. Ethan turned back to her, his expression softer now, but still carrying that steel edge. You should tell me exactly what's going on, he said, because something tells me this isn't the first time he's crossed a line. Lena hesitated. She had spent months keeping the details to herself, afraid that sharing them would somehow make the danger more real. But something in Ethan's steady gaze made her think, for the first time in a long time, that maybe she didn't have to fight this battle alone. The truth spills out. For a long moment after Mateo was escorted out, the office remained wrapped in a strange kind of silence, the kind that comes after a storm when the air is still heavy with electricity. Lena stood near the glass wall, her fingers gripping the strap of her red backpack so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. Ethan didn't rush her, didn't demand an immediate explanation. Instead, he simply poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal carafe on the conference table and set one in front of her, sliding it across the polished surface without a word. It was such a simple act, but it broke through the wall of panic in her chest. She sank into one of the sleek leather chairs, trying to find her voice. When she finally began to speak, her tone was quiet but steady, like someone forcing themselves to step barefoot across broken glass. She told Ethan how she had met Mateo when she was working at a small cafe a year ago, how he had been charming at first, tipping generously, showing up every morning with the same warm smile and just the right words to make her feel seen. She explained how he had convinced her to quit her job to focus on herself, only for his real nature to surface once she was financially dependent on him. The controlling questions, the sudden bursts of anger over nothing, the way he made her feel like every problem was somehow her fault. She spoke of the day she walked out with nothing but a backpack of clothes and her phone, and how since then, Mateo seemed to appear wherever she went, like a shadow she couldn't shake. "I've filed reports," she said, her voice trembling now, "but they always say there's not enough to hold him, no proof, just my word against his." Ethan listened without interrupting, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his eyes locked on her face. He didn't look at her with pity, something she both feared and hated, but with a quiet, assessing focus, like every word she said was another piece in a puzzle he was determined to solve. When she finally stopped speaking, Ethan leaned back slightly, tapping a finger once against the table as if he had made a decision. "What's his full name?" he asked. Lena hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mateo Cruz." The name hung in the air for a beat, and she saw a subtle shift in Ethan's expression, a glint in his eyes that suggested recognition, though he didn't confirm it. Instead, he reached for his phone, typed something quickly, and sent it without looking up. Within minutes, there was a soft knock on the door, and a man in his late 40s entered, carrying a slim laptop. Ethan gestured for him to set it down, and without any introductions, the man began pulling up files. Lena didn't know exactly what was happening, but she understood enough to realize that Ethan was not only listening, he was acting. On the screen, pages of information began appearing: public records, business filings, property ownership. There were photographs of Mateo at various events, his arm around different women in different cities. "He's not just following you," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "He's done this before." Lena's stomach twisted as she leaned closer, reading a line in a police report about a woman in another state who had filed a restraining order against Mateo 3 years ago, only for the case to mysteriously disappear. The man with the laptop glanced at Ethan. "There's more, but it's not public. We'll need to dig deeper." Ethan nodded once. "Do it." He then turned his attention back to Lena, his voice softening. "You've been handling this alone for too long. That ends today." His words should have felt like an intrusion, a stranger stepping into the most personal and dangerous part of her life. But instead, they felt like a door she hadn't known was there, being opened just enough to let the light in. She wanted to protest, to tell him she couldn't ask for this kind of help, but the truth was she had never felt so seen, so instantly understood. Outside the conference room, the hum of the office continued, but inside something had shifted. Lena realized that this wasn't just about hiding from Mateo anymore. It was about facing him. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she'd have to do it alone. Ethan, for reasons she couldn't yet name, had decided to stand between her and the man who had spent months trying to break her down. And while she didn't know what that meant for the days ahead, she could feel in her bones that this was only the beginning of a much bigger storm. The net tightens. The rest of that day passed in a strange haze for Lena. After her conversation with Ethan, he insisted she remain in his office until security confirmed that Mateo had left the building entirely. His assistant brought her coffee without asking questions, the staff moving around with quiet efficiency as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet she could feel the subtle difference in the way people looked at her now. It wasn't suspicion nor gossip, but something closer to curiosity. She had the distinct sense that in this world of polished glass walls and hushed meetings, Ethan Blackwell's attention was not something given lightly. The knowledge made her both uneasy and oddly reassured. By late afternoon, Ethan emerged from his private office, his suit jacket off and his shirt sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. He carried an energy that was calmer than earlier, but underneath it was a current of intent, like a man who had made up his mind about something and was already setting it into motion. "I've had my people start digging into Mateo's history beyond what we found this morning," he told her, pulling out a chair across from hers. "This isn't just about keeping him away from you. If there's a pattern, and I'm certain there is, we can build something that forces the law to act, whether they want to or not." Lena listened, torn between gratitude and fear. Gratitude, because no one had ever gone this far for her before. Fear, because she knew what Mateo was capable of when cornered. "He doesn't like losing," she warned softly, her hands wrapping around her coffee cup as though it could anchor her. "If he realizes you're involved, he'll see it as a challenge." Ethan's mouth curved in a faint, almost dangerous smile. "Then let him." It wasn't arrogance, It was a simple, matter-of-fact statement, like someone talking about a business competitor rather than a volatile ex-boyfriend. Yet there was something in the way he said it that made her believe he wasn't underestimating the threat. He was simply ready to meet it head-on. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Ethan walked her to the lobby. The rain had started again, a soft drizzle painting the streetlights in a muted glow. Before she stepped outside, he paused, his voice low. "I'll have someone follow you. For protection, not surveillance. You won't always see them, but they'll be there." Lena wanted to refuse, to cling to the last threads of her independence, but the memory of Mateo's eyes earlier made her nod instead. She stepped out into the damp evening, the city air cool against her skin, unaware that Ethan's gaze followed her until she disappeared around the corner. Across town, in a dimly lit apartment with blinds drawn tight, Mateo sat at his kitchen table, his phone glowing with a list of missed calls from a blocked number. His jaw was set, his mind replaying the image of Ethan standing between him and Lena. That moment had ignited something ugly in him, a cocktail of humiliation, possessiveness, and a wounded pride that burned hotter the more he thought about it. He began scrolling through his contacts until he stopped at a name that made his lips curl into a slow, deliberate smile. If Ethan Blackwell wanted to interfere, Mateo would make sure he understood the cost. He dialed the number. By the next morning, Ethan's head of security handed him a slim folder containing details that made his expression tighten. A property Lena had once lived in, owned by a distant cousin, had been vandalized overnight. Nothing stolen, but windows smashed, locks destroyed, and a message spray-painted across the front door. "You can't hide forever." Ethan closed the folder slowly, his jaw working once before he spoke. "He's escalating," he said, more to himself than to the man standing across from him. Then without another word, he reached for his phone. The person on the other end answered immediately, and Ethan's voice was as cold and precise as steel. "Move to phase 2. I want every thread of his life pulled until there's nothing left for him to hold on to." For Lena, the day began like any other, until she received a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "He's watching you." She stared at it for a long time, the world around her tilting slightly. But instead of panicking, she took a deep breath and did something she hadn't done in months. She called Ethan, and when he answered, his voice was steady, as if he'd been expecting her call all along. "You are safe," he said, "but it's time we stop waiting for him to make the next move. Phase 2. The following morning, Lena found herself back in Ethan's office, though this time it wasn't by accident or desperation. She had agreed to meet him after his cryptic phone call the night before, though a small part of her wondered if she should be afraid of what Phase 2 really meant. When she entered, the space felt different, not in its design, but in its energy. The staff seemed sharper, more alert. Phones rang less, conversations were shorter, and more than once she noticed Ethan's employees exchanging brief, knowing glances as she passed. It was as though everyone in the building understood something significant was unfolding, even if they didn't know the details. Ethan was at the head of the long conference table, sleeves rolled back, a series of files spread out before him. He motioned for her to sit, and when she did, he pushed one of the folders toward her. Inside were photographs, bank statements, and contracts with Mateo's name across them. "This," Ethan began, his voice steady and unhurried, "is the foundation of the life he's built, and this is how we dismantle it." He explained in clear, measured tones how his investigators had found a trail of questionable business dealings, unpaid taxes, falsified invoices, and connections to people who operated in the gray space between legality and outright crime. "Men like Mateo," Ethan continued, leaning forward slightly, "thrive on the illusion of control. You take that illusion away, you take away their power." Lena's first instinct was disbelief. It felt surreal to see Mateo's life reduced to paper and numbers, to have proof that he wasn't the untouchable force he had always pretended to be. Her second instinct was caution. If you do this, he won't just back down. He'll fight harder. Ethan's eyes met hers without wavering. "Good," he said. "I'd rather fight him here, on my terms, than have you looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life." There was something in his voice, not just resolve, but a quiet protectiveness that made her chest tighten. She didn't know when exactly the shift had happened, but this was no longer just about strategy or defense. This was personal for him now. Over the next 2 days, Phase 2 unfolded like a silent storm. Ethan never told her every detail, but she could sense the ripples. Mateo's access to certain accounts was suddenly frozen. Suppliers refused his calls. A property he was negotiating to buy fell through at the last minute when the seller mysteriously pulled out. Lena stayed mostly at Ethan's office, partly for safety and partly because it had become the only place she didn't feel like prey. He made no effort to hide his presence in her day, sometimes checking in between meetings, sometimes just passing her a coffee as though it were the most natural thing in the world. But there was also an unspoken undercurrent between them now, a growing awareness in every glance, every pause in conversation, every moment they lingered in the same room just a fraction longer than necessary. On the third evening, as the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows began to glow in the amber light of sunset, Ethan returned from a meeting with a look that made Lena straighten in her chair. "We flushed him out," he said simply. "He's scrambling, calling in favors, leaning on people who don't want to be leaned on anymore." He placed another folder in front of her, and inside was a printed email chain between Mateo and a man in the city council, discussing how to get a restraining order against him thrown out. The emails were laced with threats and bribes, undeniable proof of corruption. "With this," Ethan said, "we can go to the authorities, and this time they'll have no choice but to act." But before relief could settle in, Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression tightening. "Security picked something up," he murmured. Without another word, he tapped the screen and placed it on speaker. The voice that came through was tense, clipped. "We've got movement. 2 men outside Miss Rodriguez's old apartment, checking the windows, the locks. One of them matches Mateo." Lena's stomach dropped, a cold rush flooding her chest. She looked at Ethan expecting panic, but instead found that same calm steel she had seen the first time they met. He ended the call, pocketed his phone, and spoke with quiet certainty. "Then we end this tonight." The last move. Night settled over the city like a velvet curtain, the streets slick from an earlier rain reflecting the fractured glow of streetlights and passing cars. Lena sat in the passenger seat of Ethan's black SUV, her hands resting in her lap, trying to still the restless beat of her heart. She had never been part of a plan like this before, a plan that felt both precise and dangerous. Ethan had explained it to her on the way. They had undeniable evidence against Mateo, but to make it airtight, they needed him caught in the act. His team had been quietly tracking him for days, and tonight, they knew exactly where he would be. It wasn't just about ending the threat, it was about making sure he could never circle back into her life again. The SUV pulled into an underground garage beneath one of Ethan's properties, a building he rarely used for business, chosen precisely because it would seem like neutral territory. The space was dimly lit, its concrete walls echoing with the low hum of fluorescent lights. Security cameras were positioned at every angle, each feed monitored by a small team in a control room 1 floor above. Lena glanced at Ethan, who was sitting beside her, calm in that unnerving way. He had, the same way he had been the first time she hid between his legs, the same way he had stood between her and Mateo in his office. "You're sure about this?" she asked quietly, her voice almost lost in the cavernous space. He turned his head to meet her gaze, and for the first time that night his expression softened. "I don't start something I can't finish," he said, and she knew he meant every word. Minutes later, a car rolled into the garage, an expensive black sedan with tinted windows. It stopped a few spaces away and the driver's door opened. Mateo stepped out, dressed in a dark leather jacket, his movements casual but his eyes sharp. He looked around once, spotting Ethan almost immediately, and smirked like a man who believed he still had the upper hand. "I wondered when you'd stop hiding behind your money and face me," he said, his voice carrying across the concrete. Ethan didn't move from where he stood, but his presence was enough to command the space. "I'm not hiding," he replied evenly. "I'm giving you one last chance to walk away before you destroy yourself." Mateo laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it, and took a step closer. "You think you've scared me? You're just a rich boy playing hero for a girl you barely know." Ethan's eyes flicked toward Lena for just a moment, and the look was enough to steady her. He was playing a game, and every move had a purpose. You've been sloppy, Ethan said, his tone shifting to something colder, more deliberate. Your accounts are frozen, your friends are disappearing, and your secrets aren't secrets anymore. He nodded subtly, and from the shadows near the far wall, two men stepped forward. Ethan's security, both holding small recording devices that were already capturing everything. Mateo's smirk faltered. What is this? He demanded. Proof, Ethan said simply. The police are waiting for Taz, his conversation, and you're going to give them everything they need. What followed was a tense back and forth that stretched on for minutes, each exchange pulling Mateo deeper into the trap. He tried to deflect, then to threaten, but Ethan countered every move with precision, steering him into admitting enough. The harassment, the tracking, even hints of past intimidation, all caught on camera. And then, just when Mateo seemed to realize what was happening, the echo of footsteps filled the garage. Two uniformed officers emerged from the elevator, badges glinting under the harsh lights. Mateo's bravado cracked, his eyes darting between Ethan, the officers, and Lena, who now stood with her shoulders back, refusing to flinch under his glare. The arrest was swift, though not without a final moment of venom. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Mateo leaned toward Lena, his voice low and seething. This isn't over. But before the words could take root, Ethan stepped in, his voice a quiet wall of finality. Yes, it is. The officers led Mateo away, his figure disappearing into the elevator, the sound of the doors closing echoing through the garage like the slam of a cell door. When the noise faded, Lena found herself breathing in a way she hadn't in months, deep, unbroken breaths that felt like freedom. She turned to Ethan, wanting to say 1,000 things but unsure where to begin. I don't know how to thank you, she managed. He shook his head slightly. You don't owe me thanks, Lena. You owe yourself peace. That's what this was about. But as they walked toward the SUV, there was something in the way his hand brushed against hers. A subtle, unspoken acknowledgement that this was no longer just about safety. Somewhere in the chaos, the lines between protector and partner had blurred. In the weeks that followed, Lena's life slowly began to return to something resembling normal. Though normal now meant the occasional text from Eti, hand checking in, invitations to lunch that sometimes turned into long conversations about nothing and everything, and the knowledge that if she ever needed him, he would answer before the first ring ended. She began to believe in safety again, and more surprisingly, she began to believe in possibility. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony of Ethan's penthouse, the city stretching out below them in a wash of lights, he glanced at her and said almost casually, When you ran to me that day, I thought it was random, but now I think maybe it wasn't. Lena smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. You think it was fate? He didn't answer with words, just with the kind of look that made her chest tighten in the best way. And for the first time since she could remember, she didn't feel like she was running anymore. She felt like she had finally stopped in exactly the right place.